Hi everyone, welcome to the Dingle Literary Festival, and this event features Brian McMahon in his book, The Fate and Fury. My name is Ty Coakley. It's lovely to be here today. Thanks to the festival for inviting me. So I'm going to introduce the book first. I'm going to read the blurb at the back, and then I'm going to introduce Brian. Then we're going to have a good chat. I have a lot of questions about this book, and then I'll open the questions out to the audience, so feel free to ask questions, and as we said, Brian will be signing books after the event. So, the work of Church of Ireland evangelicals in West Kerry between 1825 and 1845 was widely hailed as a model of a successful missionary campaign. It evoked, however, a passionate reaction from local Catholic priests. The missionaries wished to entice the Irish-speaking people of the Dingle Peninsula away from what they saw as superstition and enthrallment to Rome, while priests objected to what they saw as inducements offered to Catholics to convert. As new mission schools and churches were built, the war of words between clergymen of both persuasions was fomented by rival newspapers, reaching a climax in a notorious libel case of March 1845. In this study, Brian McMahon gives a comprehensive overview of the origins and progress of the conversion campaign and the responses to it. The narrative brings the personalities involved into vivid focus and records the long-lost voices and values of those on both sides of the bitter divide. Brian McMahon is an author and historian whose previous books include The Great Famine in Tralee and North Kerry, 2017, and Ascend or Die, Richard Crosby, Pioneer of Balloon Flight, 2010. He has contributed to a range of historical journals, including History Ireland, Dublin Historical Record, and The Irish Sword. Please welcome Brian McMahon.
Thank you.
Well, Brian, the book is an outstanding achievement. Congratulations on it.
Thanks.
Not only is it so rigorously written, and so well sourced, but it's also so readable, with compelling characters and voices and stories. You brought it all to life. I have a lot of questions about the book, but the first question I want to ask you is, why are you so interested in history? How did that begin for you?
Curiosity, I think Tig explains it really. I grew up in Ballyheigue, and there's the facade of an old castle, as we call it. It dates from the early 1800s, but I was always asking questions about it. And likewise, visiting Corcagina as well, asking questions about the buildings and the ruins and the remains that I could see around here. So it goes back a while.
Yeah.
Before we get into detail on it, I was thinking today that the mission here generated a lot of interest in the islands, the islands of the North Atlantic, Britain and Ireland, and lots of visitors came. And one woman kept a diary, and she wrote about her visit here: "A wet Sunday in Dingle, can anything be more dreary?" And she had no coffee shops or bookshops or places to visit back then.
Or festivals, yeah. And why do you think history is so important as a society? Why do we have to pay attention to history?
I think really from the landscape around us, I think speaks to us really, and the buildings that I was saying, for example, on the Blasket Island, the first building you see on the left is the ruins of the old Protestant mission school, and not a lot is made of it now, but it was the school that brought the first books to the island. The island became an island of books later, but the first books on that island were the Bible and the primers that they used in the school and it was a school through Irish. When the national school came eventually in the 1860s or so, there was no Irish in the national school. So it deserves to be remembered. But as I went along in this particular study area as well, there was a growing sense of an injustice to be righted, because the people that I was writing about were marginalized in their own time. They were on the fringes of society by definition as the Protestant minority in the area. But also they were marginalized in history. They spoke and wrote and communicated an awful lot in their time, but it was almost as if it was suppressed in the 180 years that has passed since then, you know. And I just got a sense of, I want to right an injustice here and shine a spotlight on these people and at least give them a hearing, not to fall down on one side or the other and say,
their
who's
voices
right.
especially.
Yeah,
which
and to hear them in their own voices.
Yeah. And you've done that, really. So can we start maybe with the Evangelical Campaign and the Irish Society, which was founded in 1818? Can you say something about that?
Yes, the Irish Society for the Education of the Native Irish through the medium of their own language, the Irish Society for short, was founded in 1818. And its objective was really to spread the Irish Bible around in the Irish-speaking areas. People that we'll be talking about later pointed out of the about 6 million, I suppose, that were in Ireland at the time, there were 3 million Irish speakers, and maybe 1 million of those spoke only Irish. The others had Irish and English, and that they were a neglected group. In the year 1822, the Archbishop of Dublin, Archbishop McGee, launched or gave official affirmation to the kind of evangelical movement, where he encouraged the spread. It was a kind of a new Reformation, a second Reformation, they referred to it as. Evangelical movements around the country, and that is regarded now with the bicentenary that was celebrated in Maynooth recently, an academic conference, and so that gave a great impetus to people. So within that evangelical movement, there was a group that said, look, the Roman Church, as they called it, the Catholic Church as we refer to it now, but the Roman Church tries to communicate people in a foreign language, Latin. The Mass is in Latin and everything. The Protestant Church, or the Anglican Church, is likewise doing the same thing, communicating with these Irish speakers, monoglots maybe, through a foreign language, English. And they said, that's an injustice. Let's try and communicate with them in their own language.
And they were very well funded from Britain, really.
They were. Funding was a big thing, and the raising of funds, you know, and that's where the women, lots of women were involved in the movement, and principally as fundraisers, and they had their own equivalent of WhatsApp for drawing in money, because they were communicating by letters, and little small amounts were being sent through the post to them, and they became
to save the Irish.
Save the Irish. And saving was a big thing. You know, salvation was crucial to it. Salvation and damnation. You know, it was a time of absolutes. Our side had salvation, and the other side was the road to perdition, the road to damnation.
Exactly.
And there was no grey area.
And you mentioned the Second Reformation there, which was referred to, but you also mentioned in your introduction cultural imperialism. So we have to bear in mind that this was British imperialism at Act Two.
It was, and they were bringing civilization as well as the church, the Protestant religion, and so on.
I mean, some of the references to the local people as Aborigines, peasants, you know.
That's right, and particularly the woman, A.M. Thompson, Anna Maria Thompson, who wrote a book about it. She took a special care of the Blaskets, the mission to the Blaskets, and she describes her first visit to the Blaskets and how difficult it was for a woman to make that leap from the boat onto the pier, onto the quay. And she describes them in those terms, you know, that they were primitive. The people were there chewing seaweed, Dillisk, I guess, at the time.
And of course, the role of Irish in the campaign was central to it.
Yes, Irish for them was a medium. You know, it was a way of conveying their message, the only way of conveying the message. But there's a great magic about it all. In the early years, there were distinct phases in this campaign, even in the short 20 years that I cover, 20 years of growing, if you like, from 1825 to 1845. But the first phase of it, there's a lovely warm glow coming from the work of lay missionaries, scripture readers, as they call them, who went around the countryside here, just distributing Bibles, reading from the Bible. And so for the people here who were not illiterate people at the time, they saw a man reading from a book in the language that they were speaking all their lives, but they never knew it was in a book or that you could write it down. So hearing it first of all in their own beautiful language, and then learning to read it for themselves in their own language, and then learning to write in this language. There was a liberation involved, but there was also this sense of wonder at the world.
And that closeness as well. You know, they understood it when they went to Mass. There was a priest in Latin with his back to them, up here. So, I mean, that was, but it was like a Trojan horse in a way. It was a way to get in.
And there's another question about the Mass tide, because it's not quite, when we think of Catholic Ireland and that, you know, here in West Kerry or Dingle and places west of it, They were places that weren't penetrated by priests too often, you know.
Mm-hmm.
They came to collect their dues, but definitely on the Blasket Islands, that's all, the only visit. The only time they saw a priest was when he was visited for his dues, because the priests weren't there. The numbers weren't there in this post-penal time.
And the local people on Sunday morning would go down to the beach and look over at Dunquin and imagine the Mass being said.
Yeah, like a virtual
It's
Mass.
unbelievable.
That's right, yeah. A flag went up on the mainland when Mass was being said in Dunquin, and the people from the island were reputed to know that, to see the flag, and then to kneel down in prayer and sort of have a virtual Mass, commune with them during the Mass time. Yeah.
It's amazing. And one of the things that lights up the book are the people involved, really, the characters especially, amazing characters, really. But can we start with David Peter Thompson, D.P. Thompson? Yeah,
D.P. Thompson was the agent of Lord Ventry, so he hadn't a primary role in the missionary campaign, but his wife did a very central role. Yeah. And when Lord Ventry wasn't in residence, they stayed in his house, which is Coláiste Ida now. And that's one of the buildings, of course, that, you know, invites us to question. It's this massive, beautiful building in a lovely setting, as does Ballintaggart and Farranakilla and the great Glebe House, or Granville House as we know it in Ballyferrett. These are the kind of places that pose the questions, say, how did these magnificent houses get built here in the 1830s in pre-famine Ireland, or earlier in the case of Coláiste Ida. So that was his role. And
it was a huge estate, 2,000 tenants, and he got into trouble with the Kerry Examiner, and we'll talk about newspapers in a minute, because he evicted 230 tenants.
A very unpopular man, man. But like a lot of landlords' agents at the time, he was a manager, and he was doing what he saw best as a manager of the estate, so as to ensure maximise the income, and that meant people had to leave. Evictions.
And two other important evangelicals were George Gubbins and Reverend Charles Gare. Can you say something about them?
A little bit. George Gubbins was based in Ballyferrett, and he's the one who was responsible for the building of Granville House, which you all probably know. It still stands out on the landscape, very much overlooking the Three Sisters there. A magnificent building and a great history behind it. It later became an RSC barracks in a later time and was added to. And George Gubbins was a freelancer. He was there on his own before the campaign really began. You know, he did a lot of good for the people at a time of cholera, an awful lot of good. But he was transferred by his bishop, much to his own regret, for many reasons. He loved the area, but also his firstborn child, Eva, was buried in the nearby Dunurland cemetery, and her headstone is still there. She died aged 6 months, I think, or 2 years, something like that, very, very young. And for that reason, he didn't want to be transferred, but was to County Limerick. A great admiration for him. I wasn't able to get as much information about him as I hoped.
And of course, Charles Gare kind of came a bit later.
Charles Gare then. That was, as I was saying, there was a lovely warm glow about the early phase of this campaign, but it started to get bitter and started to get confrontational with the arrival in 1833 of Charles Gare, an Englishman. And a few foreign fanatics was the way these missionaries were often described. They weren't all foreign, as we'll see with Tom Moriarty, but this man was English, and he never did master Irish and never became one of the people, as Gubbins did, in fact, and another man, Goodman, that family as well, who were several ministers in the Goodman family, and they were very, very Irish and, as we know, involved in music and traditional, the preservation of traditional tunes and so on as well. But Gare was based here in Dingle, nominally a curate to Reverend Goodman and the chaplain to Lord Ventry. And he was the man really who stirred up the confrontation. And it came directly between him and the parish priest, Father John O'Sullivan. And so from the pulpit on Sunday and on the following day in the newspapers, which also sided with whatever side they were partial to, there were great tirades, which make for sad reading in a way when you look back on it and say, what was it all about? Why did all this happen? It's quite sad at this stage, but objectively as a reader, it makes for exciting reading and great English. It's very Dickensian and very...
But it's vicious in the newspapers. Vicious, I mean, we don't... The only thing you'd see something like that now is in social media.
Yeah, and we don't have any tirades from the altar anymore, do we?
No, we don't. No, we don't. We won't talk about that.
No.
And then you mentioned Thomas Moriarty. He was a game changer, really, wasn't he?
He was,
Because he wasn't a blow-in.
He wasn't a blow-in. He wasn't one of the men they could call one of a few foreign fanatics. No, he was a Dingleman and came from a prominent family. His mother was
a Catholic family.
A Catholic family,
Yeah.
and independently he was converted to Protestantism. Independently because he had an inquiring mind. He asked questions of what he saw before him and what he heard from the Catholic pulpits, and he came to the conclusion that that wasn't the direction he wanted to follow. And he became a leading light then. He went on from Dingle to Kilkenny for schooling, and from Kilkenny to Trinity College, where he became ordained, and he became one of the very, very few Church of Ireland ministers who was a native Irish speaker, and who was also an academic and a very good performer and a charismatic figure. Yeah. And he began his clerical career in Kings Court, County Cavan, that area, Kings Court, County Meath, County Cavan, and was influential there until he was persuaded to come back here and to situate himself in Ventry.
Yeah, and he was a minister for 24 years, but there's a great quote on page 107. Will you read that, Brian?
I'm not sure. I have a page marked here. It's not 107, but you tell me what one you mean.
You read your piece there.
Okay, this is Tom Moriarty himself describing his return to his native place and how he spent his days. He said he would spend his days walking around in the villages and come home in the evening very hoarse. And this is how he describes it, and you'll see what I mean. This beautiful English, and this could be examined and tested, everything he says here. I'll comment on it after reading it. In one village, we began to converse with a man at a gable end of one of the houses. Very soon, the people in the village at the time were attracted by this and stood listening at the ends of the rows of houses. A river divided the village, and the women were beetling in it. They were beating flax for linen. They listened. A man comes up with a cleave or basket on his back, and he stops to listen. Another with a ladder, and a smith with a hammer. Some who were thatching ceased their work to listen. I exposed every error of their church, sketched how the Lord brought myself out of it, and invited them into the true Holy Catholic Church, of which Christ alone is the head. We parted in peace and with a blessing. He says Holy Catholic Church about his Protestant church, Catholic with a small c, meaning universal. To him, the other church was the Roman Church, not as we know it now, the Catholic Church, the Roman Church. So that was his view. He continues, I have no doubt but that we are only in the infancy of a great work. And then, my heart throbs with delight at the thought of providing for my country, the only balm for its wounds, the gospel preached by the church in their own language. And that was his vision of things, you know,
and you
it
can
captures
tell,
it.
You can tell from that he was a compelling character.
Yes.
He was obviously a great orator, and speaking in their own language to local people.
Yeah.
He must have won over a lot of them. Yeah.
And before his family name, Thomas Moriarty, his family status, the others in his family, some of whom converted, not all, almost all eventually. They were very important. His sons went on to be ministers, and his brother's sons went on. His brother became a minister, and his sons too went on. So there's a whole line of, and they didn't serve in this part of the world. They served mostly in Northern Ireland, as we would say now, or in the northern counties at that time. Yeah.
And of course, on the other side, we'll talk about superism later, but he wasn't induced by money or any of those things at all. It was a belief system.
It was, very
But
much so.
on the other side, you had Father John O'Sullivan, who may have actually stood here, I don't know, but...
This is a later building, no.
Is it? Okay, right.
Not so much here,
Okay, but he was a very strong character too.
Very strong, yes. A man who achieved great fame and deserved fame in later years as the parish priest of Kenmare, about whom a book has been written recently as well. But yes, he was a formidable opponent, and Charles Gare and John O'Sullivan were the two who were sniping at each other in a way now that is, as I say, it's more than embarrassing. It's almost shameful to hear the kind of insults that they were trading from week to week. Although on the Church of Ireland side, they tended to be quite restrained and rational and sober, and you know, the emotional tirade came from the Catholic pulpits, I would have to say, and I think you would agree reading it here as well. One of the newspapers, you talked about newspapers, I'll read from the account in a newspaper which caused the libel The Kerry Examiner was the newspaper which favoured the Catholic Church and referred to these missionaries as yelping curs, bitter, snarling mongrels. That's what I mean about the language. But this is the text which led to the libel case, which after many years of forbearance and patience, Charles Gare decided this had to be brought to court. So this is the paragraph that offended in the Examiner. It is really astonishing to what lengths the spirit of falsehood and fabrication will carry the hypocritical dealers in cant, the whole tribe of pharisaical traffickers in tea, tracts, and fraud. So frequent are their lies, and the lies uttered by all and each of these false teachers, these wolves in sheep's clothing, and the unfortunate dupes that compose their flocks, that even if we had as many quills as a porcupine, we could not do justice to them. A lie is never out of place or out of season with them. So it was that accusation of lying that really forced them into the courts eventually in the 1845.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the libel case later and what happened. But of course, D.P. Thompson took a libel case as well from the Kerry Examiner about how they described the evictions, and he won that case too.
He did, he won that case.
And the man who wrote it went to prison.
He did, and you could write a book about that man, Patrick Robert
Byrne. Yeah.
That's right, the editor of the Kerry Examiner, who, if we could tell the full story, a marvellous book and a marvellous character in his own right as well. I think newspapers back then were one-man shows, really, the editor and the printer. They weren't a team of reporters or anything, so almost everything in it was written by himself. I have great admiration for them. And the amazing thing was that in the town of Tralee, there were 3 newspapers being published. And then the Cork Examiner gave a lot of attention to this part of the world as well. But the Kerry Examiner and the Tralee Chronicle and the Kerry Evening Post, and they were all on different sides. So between the 3 of them, if one made a statement that was clearly incorrect, the other would be quick to jump on it. And so between the 3 of them, you might be able to weave a path towards some kind of truth. But for the researcher, it's a wonderful resource to have all
and
these.
Of course, John Sullivan kept a diary as well, which must have been gold for you.
It was.
And he annotated one of the books, didn't he?
He did. He annotated, yes. I mentioned that Mrs. Thompson wrote the account. The women played a prominent role in this, apart from fundraising and behind the scenes and that, and being supportive of the men. A.M. Thompson, it took me a long time to find her actual name. She's most often referred to as Mrs. D.P. Thompson, after her husband's initials. But she wrote an account of it. She wrote it in the year 1845 as well, which was another good reason maybe for stopping there in this book. And John O'Sullivan annotated it and took exception to where he thought she was wrong or incorrect or had given the wrong name and so on. And that copy of her book is available in the County Archives in Tralee.
That's gold for you. You must have been cheering when you knew about that.
There were a few times like that when I turned up material that I hadn't expected to. Another one was how the famous college in Dublin, St. Columba's, which is one of the prestigious schools in the country now. At one stage, they realized that for this to be sustainable, they would have to have clergy who could speak Irish. They would have to train their own Irish-speaking clergymen, and Thomas Moriarty came into that because he proposed Ventry as the location for this college to train seminary, in other words, I suppose, to train clergymen. And it went along quite far along the road towards having it in Ventry. Ultimately, the group who was involved changed their minds, and they went to Stamullen, County Meath, and subsequently to where St. Columba's is now in Whitechurch, County Dublin. But Moriarty did go ahead and build his own college anyway.
He did in Ventry. And it still stands today, a lot of it, the private houses.
Yes, just left of the shops and the pub there. That's the Ventry Collegiate School, as it was called.
And some of the stories in the book are absolutely amazing and shocking, and the language there that you read in the newspaper is shocking, but one of the most shocking stories in the book is about the excommunication of Ellen Waters. Can you tell us about that here in Dingle?
Yeah, again, it's one of those stories you prefer not to have heard about it or read it. It is quite appalling, really. A poor woman whose only offence was to send her child to the Protestant school here in Dingle town. And again, we're talking about early 1830s now. And she was read from the altar, as we used to say long ago. The priest spoke about her from the altar and excommunicated her, very formally, putting on black robes and in the most solemn way, reading out her name. And causing great grief to the congregation, obviously, and all of it appeared in the newspapers verbatim, and it comes in from two sources, so we can say, yes, this is an accurate account of what happens. And in his diary, which you mentioned, is available in the diocesan archives, he admits to it himself and says, yes, I did that. And it wasn't that she was a convert or anything. She was simply sending her child to a Church of Ireland school, you know. And of course, when you read something like that and you think of conflicts over schooling in Northern Ireland and modern conflicts and things, you say, oh my God.
But it's like something out of the Middle Ages, you know, the Spanish Inquisition, rather
the way
than
he dresses up.
Exactly.
And makes a big formal declamation
exactly.
about it.
And she was pregnant, and her husband had deserted her. I mean, it's a shocking story. And as a novelist, I have to say, there's a great novel in her. But I went to read a little bit from A.M. Thompson's account, and she's biased, of course, but she says that Ella Matters, who was pregnant, was anathematized and excommunicated by the dramatic ritual of bell, book, and candle performed by the priest at the end of Mass. And she describes this solemn ritual conducted by the priest in black robes, as you mentioned, but I'll just give the details. Well, they're shocking. The priest is to commence by ringing a bell to summon all to hear, then close the book of life on the refractory individuals. To close the book of life on her and calling her name aloud, extinguishing the candle on the altar, by which is meant the light of heaven is extinguished unto them, and that are given unto Satan and the powers of darkness. I mean, that's incredible language, really.
It was, and the child in her womb was cursed, unfortunately. That was part of it as well, the child. He cursed every inch of her carcass, as one reporter said, including the child. So it is tough reading.
It is, and of course it was a great propaganda tool for the evangelicals too, you know.
That's the other thing you have to think about. That's what I meant to say about what I read from Thomas Moriarty there. Remember what he was writing there about his visit to the village, which I would say was Dunquin. He was writing for those who were paying his salary, and he was writing for those who were contributing to their coffers, you know, with sending money along. So you have to tease it out a little bit and say, you know, what's his aim here? And he went on speaking tours around Ireland and Scotland and England and Wales as well, where he would speak to large groups, and then at the end there would be a collection for the marvellous work that was going on in Dingle. And of course, a big issue, as I said, there was a lovely, warm, innocent glow about the early phase, but when the clergymen came in and started the altered pulpit tirades and so on, and then it was followed by a great injections of money. And suddenly these buildings that I mentioned started appearing in the towns and villages around Inventory and in Dunquin and Ballyferriter, and schools were being built and children were flocking to them, because even though the national school system had come in 1829, was it 1832, or that period, it took time for them to be established, so there weren't alternative schools. So these were the first schools, and they were drawing children in hundreds. And so the whole thing became a big threat to the Catholic Church, and of course eventually there was a counter Reformation to that second Reformation.
And of course, another amazing story which happened in 1884 was, 1844 was Father Dennis Brasby's conversion.
Yes.
Yeah. A priest actually converted.
A priest converted, yeah. In Kilmalcader he was based, near Ballyferriter. And the bishop had sent him, he was a young, dynamic kind of priest, judging from reports of his activities in other postings around the diocese before that. And he was ambitious too. And he was sent by the bishop to keep the fire up, he said, in the bishop's instructions. And he said, keep up the fire over there in Dingle, because we're going to win over the evangelicals. And he posted him to Kilmalcader, Ballyferriter, and within about 3 months, I think, Father Brasby dramatically announced that he was leaving the Catholic Church and becoming a Protestant himself. A process that had been underway a long time. It wasn't under the influence of any of the people we've mentioned, Moriarty or Gare or Gubbins or anyone. It was, again, an independent line. Something had been stirring in him over the years of his priesthood, but again, it was a propaganda coup, like that's the word you used, for them. And his induction into the Protestant Church took place here in Dingle Town under the protection of the Coast Guards and the Navy and the RIC, the policemen anyway, the peelers, who were here at the time, and it was a major event. And again, he wrote at great length. I said at the beginning, you know, why wasn't all this known before? Because they wrote at length about and they published in magazines, in the evangelical magazines, in the newspapers and everything. But over the 180 years since, nobody delved into it, and nobody kind of, people did delve into it, I'm sorry, that's not quite true. People did, but for articles maybe, small little pieces in journals, and there are others who have done work before I did it, but there was no comprehensive account of them, and I hope I've been able to provide that now. But Brasby was a most interesting character, and it's clear that ambition lay at the root of, you know, he had aspirations to being a bishop while he was a Catholic priest, and maybe his aspirations had been dampened a bit, and he thought he would have better prospects. He didn't, in fact. He had a sad life.
No, he did, because there was a backlash against him, even among Protestantism.
Yeah, this is it, you see. He was a suspect character, having betrayed the side once, would he do it again? So he finished up in Canada, and he's been tracked, not by me, but by researchers before me.
And Ellen Waters kind of disappeared out of history, really. Yeah, which was a pity, because
her husband died. She became a widow, and she moved to Dublin, and we lose track of her then. You know, little bit mentions of other books that she published later, all right, but again, lost track of her. But I hope that we might.
You never know. You never know, and I think she's, as a novelist, putting my novelist hat on, I mean, she'd be so compelling. And if she went to Canada and met for Brasby afterwards, you know, who knows? Who knows?
Yeah, could have happened.
But of course, there was a huge outrage on the Catholic side with that, and he had to get an armed guard, and he had to be locked away, basically, because he was in danger.
Yeah, he was in danger. And around the country, there were about 20 priests like that who had, as they used to say, apostatized, turned to the other side, and they were given great prominence and notoriety by the Protestant side as well.
We talked about the newspapers, and Chapter 9, War of Words, 1839 to 1841. I mean, you have the Tralee Mercury, the Kerry Evening Post, and the Examiner, but you've talked about how partisan it was, but it's really shocking to hear it now, isn't it?
Yes, as I read there, it is.
And there was no objectivity. They were on one side or the other.
Yeah, that's it. No grey areas. Yeah. There was a phrase I came across while I was researching. I think it's Rumi, a philosopher from, I'm not sure where, but he said, the saying is, somewhere there is a field beyond right and wrong. I will meet you there. And I adapted, when I was researching this, I kind of adapted, and I said, somewhere back west, there's a field beyond Catholic or Protestant. I will meet you there. It's an awful pity they couldn't have met as, you know, they were fine. They were great men and women on both sides, and they were highly academic, highly gifted. But if they could only have pooled their talents and energies to something that wasn't so destructive. But
there's no ecumenicalism those days.
And those who remember, those of us who might remember Ireland of the 1950s and that, I suppose we can hear some echoes of that in those times, hopefully long gone now.
And of course, the War of Words climaxed in the Great Libel case in 1845, Charles Gare versus the Kerry Examiner. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, so that was the one, as I said, that Gare's patience eventually ran out, and they went to court in Tralee, and they brought an array of witnesses to speak about, you know, whether they had been induced to convert, and we were talking about superism, I suppose, bribery. We're talking about bribery. Were they bribed to convert? And of course, some of them were, and some of them weren't. And it was the most disreputable bunch of witnesses that you could ever gather together and put in front of the court. And they were so easily
They picked the wrong people altogether. And the judge wasn't having any of it.
No. So the whole thing, it was clear from the beginning, even though it started off with lots of Catholic clergy attending and hoping for a victory. And I suppose victory and defeat was very much a part of the black and whiteness of this story as well, you know. So it turned out to be a victory for the missionaries, really, for the Protestant evangelicals. And the text of the trial was published as a book, which again is just amazing. I was trying to look up when shorthand came into use, because I was saying, how did they manage to take down every word of this 3-day hearing in the court in Tralee? Sometimes they ran out of light in the evening at one stage, and how did this one editor that I mentioned, who was the only person in charge of the newspaper, managed to capture every word of it, you know. And I think maybe shorthand did come into use just around that time, the late 1830s. Phenomenal achievement. There's a whole book in itself to be written about the newspapers and
Absolutely.
you know what they achieved at the time, and who was reading newspapers. As I said, the national schools hadn't really taken root yet fully around the country. So where was the readership for 3 newspapers every week? You know, a few times a week. They weren't dailies, but they were coming out every so often during the week.
And the other, you mentioned superism there. I mean, you know, some people were obviously induced, you know, but there was terrible hardship at the time. I mean, 39, 40 and 41, the summers were disastrous.
Yeah. That was a kind of a famine before the famine.
was a
Those
famine,
3 years in a row of great suffering.
Yeah.
When people died, not many people died, but people died of hunger on the streets of Dingle then as well.
Yeah.
And so, of course, you'd ask yourself, what would you not do for your family in a time of desperation? What would any of us not do in order to get food to feed your family or to tide you over what you knew was going to be a rough few months of winter, but also the hungry months of March before the May, June time before the potatoes crop came again for the year. So the question of, they were well aware at the time that some of the people who converted did so for the wrong reasons. And they addressed that themselves and said, yes, look, we know, but it's like the Pope said recently, who am I to judge anyone's conscience?
What would you not do for your children?
Yeah.
If your children are starving, of course you're going to do it. Yeah,
You would. Yes.
There's a great quote in the introduction, and the introduction and afterward are absolutely fantastic, Brian. They're a great achievement altogether. Summing it up, especially, and this is your words now. Some converts endured significant hardships as a result of their decision, not least the severing of familial and communal ties. Dutiful Catholics followed the advice of their priests and boycotted converts who were depicted as receiving great benefits and rewards. It took courage and independence for converts to walk away from family and friends, to become estranged from the wider community while still living and working in it. I mean, it's very tragic, really.
There are lots of verses and ballads which I include as well, and one of them has the verse, my cabin is lonesome tonight, no footfall I hear at the door.
Yeah.
The friends who were once my delight will sit by my fireside no more.
Yeah.
That was the convert, boycotted by the community because of, he'd gone to the other side. And in order to give people a bit more security and a bit more comfort, that was when the colonies were built. The colony which still exists here in Dingle, the lower colony, which is marked by the local historical society with a little plaque on it, and the upper colony on John Street, which has disappeared completely, I think. And then in Ventry as well, the row of cottages on the left-hand side as you're coming into Ventry, that was the colony at Ventry. And this was a way of having a protective grouping where they were supplied with housing and with jobs and so on too, since they had been alienated and boycotted, even though the word boycotted wasn't used, ostracized from their own community.
Yeah. I have a few more questions, Brian, but we've about 10 minutes to go, I just wanted to ask the audience, do you have any questions for Brian? Yeah, go ahead.
I understand your works, the book stops at 1845, so I'm just curious why you picked that year and what happened to this. Sorry, I started. And just sorry, I understand that the book stops at 1845, and just wondering what happens after that with regards to the how the movement fared, or even the conflict fared, as it headed into the famine years. There was, in terms of progress and expansion, there was only another 15 years at most, I think, after that, really. By 1860, it had petered out for a variety of reasons. I had to stop because it was getting too big and getting too long, and even as it is, the print is too small. I think it ought to have been bigger print, but that would have meant more pages and more expense. So I had to stop, and again, because that was the year Mrs. Thompson stopped her book, her account of it, and because it was the eve of the famine, I said, I'm going to stop here. But you're not the first one to point out, saying, you can't stop there. You have to. So that's my next
project really is to continue the story. But it's a story of decline, really. It was 20 years of growing. The numbers at around 1845, there was a big debate about the numbers, and 800 was the number they fixed on, 800 converts, out of a potential, I think, 16,200 in Dingle and places west of it is the figure I have, you know. So it was quite small, but it was the threat or the idea that it was growing that put fear into people. During the famine years, it went up to about 2,000. And by the way, those figures include children, so the numbers of adults is really quite a good deal lower than that. Possibly only 300 or 400 adults, and then the rest children out of that 800, you know. So, but it's a story of decline and victory, if you like, then for one side. That's how it was perceived, I think, down through the years. They were, as it were, run out of Dingle. And the winners write the history after that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Except when objective historians come back and balance it up, which you've done, Brian. And what happened to converts then afterwards? Was it, you mentioned immigration.
Dispersal, I think, in a word.
Yeah,
I'm
dispersal.
kind of projecting here, but I think dispersal in other parts of the country, which included Northern Ireland. I mentioned the sons of some of those Moriarty ministers finished up as ministers in the northern counties where they would find a more cohesive group of Protestants, a more stable grouping and less of a minority, but also abroad, emigration, I think, as well. And some, few remaining, but not too many. Although people would remember, older people in the areas around would remember going to school and, you know,
Church of Ireland,
grew up with people who were Protestants by tradition. There's a question there.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Forgive me, my hearing isn't great and I may have missed something, but I was interested in what you said about the newspapers, because one of the things about the Catholic Church from the early 19th century, as a result of Napoleon's taking the Pope prisoner, was that there was a sort of evangelicalization of the clergy, and they very smartly got onto modern media. And you find the bright young curates, I know this from German history, were encouraged to write articles urging the faithful, but also providing pious stories. And one of the people that they liked to quote was Maria Edgeworth, because hers were very moral tales. Yeah. But my actual question is, was the parish priest, had he ever been in Rome? Had he been sort of fired with the evangelical fervour, as many later were?
Not Rome, I don't think. I think there was Maynooth, they would be the early Maynooth graduates, you know, Maynooth, very big. And that was, no, not Rome so much. Yeah, but Rome featured very strongly in the Protestants' line against the Catholic Church. You know, they were saying that Rome was an aberration and they were they were in the apostolic line of succession, and from St. Patrick and so on, they could trace their line back. And then Rome intervened with its doctrines and its councils and its regulations and its rules and so on. There was one thing, you know, that came through from the evangelical movement, is that they were encouraging an encounter with Christ, whereas the Catholic Church was encouraging rituals and rubrics and penitence and prayers and you know, and all of that kind of thing. And they were saying, you don't need any of that. Come and meet Christ in the Bible, you know. And so it was, as Vatican II did eventually in the Catholic Church, you know, that it was more encounter with Christ, kind of. So, but no, nothing, not Rome so much. But the phrase, no peace with Rome, was one of the slogans that they had. No peace with Rome. And they kind of, that was like a letter heading for a lot of the time. Anything they wrote or communicated. No peace with Rome was the slogan.
And of course, they depicted the Roman Church as Roman, not Irish at all.
Irish,
and
yeah.
Superstition, I mean, there was talks about, you know, having mass for sick pigs and things like that. But there was a lot of propaganda.
Oh, they were
around
disgusted by
that.
this. They were saying, if the mass is genuinely, as you believe, you know, the body and blood of Christ, how can you have a mass for a sick pig or a sick cow or for a ship or for a fishing boat and things? And they thought this was, and then they talked about holy beads and holy rosaries and holy crosses, holy stones, holy garments, holy rags, holy vestments, holy water. You don't need any of that. It's much simpler, just you and Christ. There's one other quote I really want to read before we finish. I'm not, but just to say, you know, in terms of our evaluation of the church ministers now and Gare, the Englishman, I think we can't forget what they did during the famine years. And this was written by Charles Gare, the minister here in Dingle, in the month of August in 1847, Black 47, when he was responsible for building the tower that we see behind us here, Esk Tower, as a famine relief project. They did tremendous work during the famine. One of them wrote about the Blasket Island, only for us, everyone on the island would starve this year. Because of their contacts and because of their links with England and because of the funding that they had, they got food into Dingle and West Kerry at crucial times during the famine. And it's a shame that that is forgotten, and that's why I really wouldn't want to finish today without mentioning that. And this is Charles Gare, who himself died 6 months after he wrote this as a result of contracting fever, as a result of engaging with the poor and the hungry and the sick and those suffering from the various famine diseases. He was a victim of the famine too, as was the parish priest of Dingle, Charles Michael Devine, to whom there's a plaque just inside the door of Dingle Church which says that he died after inhaling, what is it, I've forgotten the phrase, inhaling the vapors of death, of the vapors of pestilence or something like that. So both men victims of the famine. This is Charles Gare, August 1847, talking about food relief. Thousands are now thrown upon what I brought, and when it is out, I fear there will be dreadful misery and starvation. I hope to make my store of food last for another week, and unless some further aid can be got by that time, I fear the people will be driven to plunder and then will lie down and die. There is no district in Ireland, I am sure, like this. I am giving food to at least 3,000 people daily. So, to me, they're famine heroes, these people as well, and they are. That has not been fully recognised and should be.
Yeah.
And that will
and
be
it is recognised
in
in this book.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Sorry, just one quick question. It reminded me of what you were saying there about Achill and the colony in Achill. I don't know if you know, but and the rivalry between the Nangle and Archbishop McHale in Mayo.
That's right.
But what happened there, according to what I remember reading about it, was that people tended to move, depending on poverty and hunger at a particular time, that they'd move between one religion and the other. They might go from Catholicism and come back to Catholicism, depending. Did that happen here?
It did, I think, really. There's a good book, The Preacher and the Prelate, is about Achill, Patricia Byrne, isn't it? People did. The veneer of religious belief was quite thin. When we talk about Ireland, Catholic country and so on, because the priests weren't penetrating and because the schools weren't doing what they call catechizing, there was very little teaching of the Catholic doctrine, let's say, Christian doctrine being taught. So it was important at crucial times like birth, marriage and death, and the priest, getting a priest for those events was important. And the priest, that was where his income came from as well. But in between times, attendance at Mass was very low. People looked at statistics around and available from the time, and and maybe 30% of those who were nominally Catholics were attending Mass on a weekly basis, which was regarded as one of the most basic regulations of the Catholic Church, that you attend the Sunday Mass. So it was a veneer, and people. It was possible for people, and these were perhaps some of the unscrupulous people who appeared in that court case as well, who were willing to serve both sides as required, and for the sake of their families, or sometimes just for mercenary reasons as well, for what they could get out of it. So, yeah. Yeah, very much so, yeah. Which begs another question: why did they devote so much time to such poor parts of the country? There was nothing in it for them. There was no money to extract from these people, and it was, to save them from damnation. That was their line anyway. That's what they said. And one woman said, there'll be no Irish spoken in heaven unless we get Irish speakers converted. So that's why we're doing it, so that Irish will be heard in heaven, because no Catholics would be going to heaven. Yeah.
Any other questions? We've time for one more. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Did the Catholic Church not at any stage realise that if they did provide help for the local people, that it would negate what the evangelists were trying to do.
Did the Catholic Church not realise?
That if they did provide some help and financial help for the people who were hungry, that it would, there'd be no need for the evangelists to be.
Oh, they did, and in fairness now, the priests were equally active, I would have to say. They were equally determined, and they too suffered personally, and the church in general. They were very loyal to their people and did what they could as well. But I think by virtue of their contacts in England and so on, the Church of Ireland ministers were, and the funds at their disposal. Like the Catholic curates had no money. They were depending on the stipends of the poorest of the poor. And what the parish priest might give to a Catholic curate out of the parish funds. You know, so there was a lot of poverty. I wouldn't, you know, the Catholic Church played their part as well. Is that the... Well, there was help from Rome as well, there was, but I suppose in the crisis period that we're talking, if you're talking about the famine years in particular now, the 1847 period, is it?
Even the 20 years before that.
Oh, yeah, not so much, again, because I think, as I was saying, it was such a small number, you know, it didn't figure largely on the national scene or the national picture, but that's what happened, and that's one of the reasons why eventually the Protestant mission died. Was there was a counter-reformation, a very determined and systematic reaction from Rome, which involved the arrival of the Vincentian order and a parish mission, and a kind of a Catholic revival happened in the years in the late 1840s, early 1850s, which eventually led to the demise of the mission. So there was a counter-reaction to it from the Catholic Church, and they won in the end, as I said.
I just want to finish with the last chapter or the last paragraph of the introduction, which I think really sums it up very well, and the introduction and afterward are absolutely brilliant, Brian. So in the decades before the famine, Dingle and West Kerry resounded with voices that were sometimes shrill, sometimes seductive, sometimes scandalous, sometimes shocking, and always stirring. The powerful voices of the missionaries and their converts have long been stilled. They spoke in other voices, different voices, challenging voices. It's few clues to Howard, Dove, or Ish. It is worth listening to them again. In the spirit of his saying, adapted from Tomás Ó Cruthain, Con gomedish bio agus id marov, so that they may be living when they are dead. And you've achieved this, Brian, in this wonderful book. Congratulations. Ladies and gentlemen, Brian McMahon.
Thank you, Clive. Thank you.